All right, everybody, welcome to this lecture. This week, we're going to be going over surveys in social science, surveys in environmental justice research. We're going to talk about, how to ask questions that matter. And, surveys may seem straightforward. You've probably taken dozens, quick questions, check some boxes, done. But designing a good survey is harder than it looks, and a bad survey creates data that's worse than useless because it gives you false confidence and potentially wrong information. So, surveys from the jump, as we've talked about, are not neutral, right? They're sites of power. When you design a survey, you, the researcher, are deciding what questions get asked, right? How they're framed, what responses are available. The people answering are responding to the frame that you've created, right? Then you control the analysis, interpretation, and how the findings get used. There's a lot of power there, and there's a lot of power concentrated in the researcher hands, right? The good news is that surveys done well and ethically, which we're going to talk about today, can be a very powerful tool for justice informed research, right? They quantify experiences that can sometimes remain invisible. They are a very accessible tool to deploy in amplifying community voices at scale. And they document patterns of environmental equality really well. But we need to be honest about the power dynamics built into survey research if we're going to do justice informed research, okay? So, again, by the end of this session, my goal for you is that you'll understand when surveys are, the right research method and when they're not. You'll learn to design clear, unbiased questions. We're going to cover sampling, which determines who you hear from and shapes your findings. It's quite critical. You're going to learn to navigate ethical considerations, including going back to FPIC, prior and informed consent, that we learned about in the context of conservation. And those same principles can very clearly apply to research. And so I'm going to show you kind of how we kind of put that into action. We're going to talk about common pitfalls to avoid. And then we're going to go over at a very high level how to analyze data and go over some examples. Okay. So, why use surveys for environmental justice, right? Well, surveys are a critical tool in the social sciences, a critical research tool when we are working with communities. They can quantify experiences, right? When one person reports health problems from pollution, let's say, officials can dismiss it as anecdotal, right? But when you have a survey that shows 70% of residents are reporting the same symptoms, that's a pattern that's harder to ignore. So, surveys, they amplify community voices at scale. They document patterns of environmental inequality with great rigor, with systematic evidence, often quantitatively with numbers. They're going to provide that data that can be used for policy advocacy because, unfortunately, decision makers they often want those numbers, right? We have to live within those confines. Surveys complement other research methods really well. We've already covered interviews. Interviews are giving you that depth, but surveys will tell you how widespread those experiences are and put the data behind that. Surveys also create data where sometimes none existed. Many marginalized communities lack official documentation of environmental exposures or health impacts. And community driven surveys can really help to fill those gaps. So we can do some research for advocacy as well. But again, we have to acknowledge that surveys also extract knowledge. And, as a researcher, you have to take people's experiences in this situation, convert them to data, and use that data for publications, degrees, and career advancement, right? But are you thinking about what the communities are getting in return? Again, we have to keep this power, reflexivity, positionality in our minds, right? And we're going to return to that throughout this lecture. So, surveys are not always the right tool. Let's talk about when to use them and when not to, right? Surveys are good for measuring how common something is, what percentage of residents smell a chemical odor, right? What proportion of people support stricter regulations. Surveys help you understand the distribution of attitudes or experiences across populations, right? They let you compare different groups to reveal disparities. You can reach large numbers of people relatively efficiently, right? And you can track changes over time with temporal or repeated studies, right? However, surveys are not so good for exploring why something happens or how processes unfold, right? So a question like why don't you trust the EPA? That's an interview question, right? That's not a survey. Surveys aren't great for building trust with communities. Let's be honest about that. Showing up with a clipboard, doesn't create relationships. Surveys struggle sometimes with complex, sensitive topics that require nuance. When that gets in play, the survey can become overwhelming. And you really can't meaningfully measure, a question like, have you experienced environmental racism with a 5 point scale, right? So surveys also don't work well in some diverse audiences, right? When literacy or language barriers exist. And critically, surveys don't work when communities need action, not more documentation. Sometimes communities are experiencing survey fatigue, right? Too many researchers have come in, they've gathered the data, they've extracted the data, they've documented, but nothing's changing, right? They never do anything with the findings. In this situation, more data is not going to be helpful, and it's really important to keep that in mind. I've experienced this quite a bit in my work. So there's different types of surveys for different purposes. Okay. Cross sectional surveys, these are snapshots at one point in time. And this is the most common that you'll find, often because of limitations around funding, research timelines, degree timelines, right? Feasibility. So in this type of survey, you're going to ask people about current situations or recent experiences. Now, longitudinal surveys track the same people over time, right? And this is really powerful when we want to understand change. We talk about structural and slow violence, things that occur over time, but they can be expensive and complicated because people move or they stop participating, right? It can be hard to get that data to be replicable. Retrospective surveys ask about the past, okay? In the past 5 years, have you experienced flooding, right? This is also quite common. They're going to rely on memory, but it's important to remember that memory can often be unreliable. Okay, we're going to talk a bit more about that. Comparative surveys measure across different groups or places. This is very helpful when you want to, let's say survey residents living near or versus far from an industrial facility to see how the health impacts are being, exposed differently. The type you choose really depends on your research question. So I can't tell you like, oh, in this situation, you would almost always want to go with this one. It really depends on the type of work you're doing and type of questions you're asking, right? And also what's appropriate for the context. And how you deliver these surveys also has, implications, right? Each method has its own trade-offs. In-person surveys are often going to get the best response rates because it's harder to say no to someone standing in front of you. I mean, that's just reality. But they're expensive. You have to pay staff, you have to travel, you have to, use your time. And there's also interviewer effects that we talked about where, who's acting or who's asking can influence the answers, right? People can do satisficing where they kind of tell you what they think you want to hear, right? Phone surveys, this used to be quite standard, but response rates have declined dramatically. Right, not everybody answers their phones. We have so many, telemarketing and scam callers these days. It's more difficult to do phone surveys. So now you see more like text-based surveys, social media-related surveys, email surveys, online surveys. You really have taken over phone surveys because they're cheap and fast. You can potentially reach hundreds of people quickly with, Google Forms or Qualtrics or something like that, right? But again, these online surveys, they can exclude anyone without internet access or computer literacy, right? We have to remember that, right? And in environmental justice context, that could be a huge amount of the population that we're seeking to get information from, right? It's not a minor issue. If your sampling method systematically excludes marginalized communities, right, you're not really getting to the heart of environmental justice. You might be reproducing it by making those community members even more invisible, right? Mail surveys are good to reach older demographics, but they have very low response rates in today's day and age, like 10 to 20% if you're lucky. Mixed mode approaches are going to combine methods to reduce bias, and they might be primarily online, but like have a phone or in-person option. It really depends on your budget, right? Like your specific context. But the point is, your choice is going to determine who participates. And that's a justice issue. That's an issue of power. It's not just logistics. Okay. So let's go into this, right? Let's talk about surveys as explicitly sites of power, right? So think about the structure of survey research, right? As I talked about at the top of the lecture, researchers decide what questions get asked. You might care about air pollution, but maybe residents care more about truck traffic or noise or lack of green space. If you don't ask about what matters to them, their concerns are going to stay invisible, right? Researchers frame the issues and participants respond within those frames. You have the power to choose the language, right? You decide what response options are available. Maybe someone's experiences doesn't fit your categories, but they're forced to pick something, right? Surveys often have this idea of forcing, right? We're forcing them to pick an answer. Again, you're also going to control the analysis, the interpretation, right? You're deciding so much of these patterns around what's significant, what matters, how results are presented, right? The survey data could become an integral part of your conference presentation or your dissertation, right? But what do participants get? Maybe it's nothing, right? And this isn't to make you feel bad or make you feel like, oh, I should be scared about doing surveys, but it's just to make you aware, right? Positionality, reciprocity. The question we should constantly ask is, how can we design surveys that share power rather than concentrating it, right? We'll explore some of those answers as we go, but just awareness of these power dynamics and identifying them and naming them and keeping them in mind is a very important foundational starting point, right? So let's get into questions, right? So writing questions is often a skill we all have to develop, right? Some call it an art. I would call it an art, right? And close-ended questions are going to provide fixed response options, right? So how often do you smell chemical odors? Never, rarely, sometimes, often, or always, right? We have a Likert scale there with options. These are often the easiest to analyze quantitatively and compare across people. But open-ended questions are going to let participants answer in their own words. So you're going to get richer data, right? What environmental concerns do you have in your neighborhood? These provide, that rich information, but it's going to be harder and more time consuming because you're going to have to analyze hundreds of different answers, right? It's not in a standardized set way. The Likert scale measures of agreement or frequency. This is typically 1 to 5 or 1 to 7. And it's, an example would be like, how much do you agree that air quality has worsened, right? Strongly disagree to strongly agree. You can also rank questions. You can use ranking questions to ask people to prioritize among options, right? So rank these environmental issues from most to least concerning. You can use matrix questions, so like in a grid, to present multiple items in the same response scale. So like you have these things and then you rank them across. You've probably seen these. This can save space, but it can create survey fatigue, right? This is where people stop reading carefully and start just clicking the same answer repeatedly. We've all done it. I know you've done it for sure. Most surveys use primarily close-ended questions for this reason, with a few open-ended for context and nuance. And we're going to talk about piloting, but you have to see how it works, right? You have to see how this balance and trade-off takes place. But your primary goal is to avoid creating survey fatigue in many situations. And this art of question writing is really where good surveys are made or broken, right? Good questions are clear and specific. Do you care about the environment? That's too vague. Care in what way? Which aspects compared to what, right? Good questions use simple language. They avoid jargon and technical terms unless you're surveying experts who are going to understand those terms, right? You want to ask one thing at a time. Do you support clean air and water regulations? This is two questions. Do you support clean air and water regulations, right? It's called double barreled. Someone might support one, but not the other, right? So now you've skewed your data. You also have to avoid leading or loaded language that's going to suggest how people should answer, right? Questions should be culturally appropriate to your audience. What's acceptable in one culture might be offensive or confusing in another. Questions need to be answerable by the respondent. Don't ask, has your air pollution exposure increased 15% over 5 years, right? Nobody knows that answer. And another thing that doesn't really get emphasized enough, it's important to frame questions structurally, just not just individually, right? So an example of this would be, a bad example would be, what steps do you take to protect yourself from pollution, right? So you're implying exposure is individual responsibility, right? A better structural question would be, what barriers, if any, prevent you from avoiding pollution exposure, right? So not what steps do you take, but what barriers, if any, prevent you from avoiding, right? So we're shifting the onus off of the individual and framing these structural issues in a structural way. Okay, and I have some examples here of some common mistakes, some examples of double-barreled leading jargon that you're welcome to review, but I'm not going to go fully in depth on these for time's sake. So some common question mistakes, right, is we talked about those. We'll skip over those. Sorry, just jumping through my notes here. So good question examples, right, are can really make a difference, right? So, like, here's some framing questions of what counts as like problems and who's responsible, right? How often do you smell chemical odors near your home? Never, really often in the past 30 days. How many days has air pollution affected your daily activities, right? These are logical framings. They are clear. The responses are clear. They're close-ended. This is a good example, okay? But really, how you frame these questions is going to shape what counts and who's responsible. And that goes back to that sort of structural individual aspect. So, some examples where surveys have been really instrumental, right? In Flint, Michigan, community surveys were one of the key tools that documented the health symptoms and water discoloration that was overlooked in official testing. When the state said the water was safe, residents in the survey showed otherwise, and they were able to use that to, fight those cases in court. In Cancer Alley in Louisiana, this is a stretch of industrial facilities along the Mississippi River. Resident surveys showed that exposure patterns and health impacts that the industry were denying were taking place. Right, these surveys provided evidence for advocacy. Some other examples are Navajo Nation of health surveys that documented uranium mining impacts that were being ignored. And we also can use this in, for example, urban heat islands to ask people, their perspectives on different areas of a city that demographic data, tree cover data might be missing, right? That could ignore. So, sampling is about who you ask, and it really fundamentally shapes what you can claim about your results, right? So, probability sampling means everyone in your population has a known chance of being selected. Okay. This means that you have, more of a random, diverse sample, and you can, posit that there's not bias within your sample, right? Now, simple random sampling is like drawing names from a hat, right? Everyone has equal probability, but they may not have a known chance, right? Stratified sampling divides your population into groups first, maybe by neighborhood, then does random sampling within each group, right? So this is good because it ensures you don't accidentally miss important subgroups. Cluster sampling selects groups rather than individuals. So you might randomly select city blocks, then survey everyone on those blocks. Systematic sampling means taking every nth, person, every fifth, every sixth person from a list. And non-probability sampling means people are selected in ways where you don't know their selection probability, where you don't know, right? And convenience sampling is whoever is available, right? Standing outside of a grocery store surveying shoppers. And you use snowball sampling based on referrals, right? So you can survey someone and ask them for names of others, right? This really works for hard to reach populations where you might not have phone, internet, and mail. Um, Purposive sampling, this is deliberately selecting specific types of people. Quota sampling is where you fill predetermined categories to ensure diverse representation, right? So again, probability sampling is going to let you generalize to a larger population with known confidence levels because there is more randomization, right? Where the trends you're observing are more reliable because they're surfacing naturally within the data, right? Non-probability sampling will not allow that sort of statistical generalization because, again, you're kind of setting predetermined aspects, right? Now there are stats that can be applied here, which we won't go into today, but let's be honest, a lot of research has to use this non-probability sampling, and that's okay as long as you're going to be honest about it in your reporting and you don't make claims that your sampling can't support, right? Getting this probability sampling in a large population randomly, that can be quite hard, especially with community work. I've never been able to achieve that. So how many people do you need, right? This is the one of the most frequently asked questions. And the answer is it depends, right? And, larger samples give you more precise estimates, but less uncertainty, right? But you get diminishing returns, right? Going from 100 to 200 people helps significantly, but let's say going from 1,000 to 1,100 barely will change that precision, right? The size of the total population really matters. If you're surveying a neighborhood with 500 households, don't need 500 surveys, right? Maybe 200 will give you good precision. In rare populations, which are challenging, right? If you're studying people with a specific condition, a rare condition, You might need to survey everyone you can find, right? It really depends on your sample and how your sample shapes up, right? So again, like let's say you want to compare subgroups, like comparing responses across three different neighborhoods, right? You need enough people in each subgroup, and that means a larger overall sample. So again, it really varies. And there is statistical ways to conduct power analyses or look at other corresponding studies and talk to experts when you're consulting this. But considering how many people need to be in your sample is critical before you deploy the survey, right? And again, I think quality matters more than quantity, right? Obviously, if you're going to try to show some statistical significance, or if really the research goals or objectives are quite quantitative, you want to be sure you achieve that significant power to be able to make those claims. But you don't just want to do 100,000 terrible surveys, right? You still want to focus on quality. And then the silent killer, the silent threat of surveys is response bias, right? So non-response bias happens when people don't respond to your survey and they differ systematically from those who do, right? This is a big problem. Often the most affected communities, they don't participate, right? People working multiple jobs, they don't have time for surveys. People who distrust institutions, often for good reasons, based on past exploitation, they don't respond to university researchers, right? So again, we have to think about if 70% of people don't respond, you're only hearing from the 30% of people who did, and they might be very different, or they might be overrepresentative of something you're looking to observe that your sample is going to show a lot more predominantly, right? So again, like maybe they're angrier or maybe they're more trusting. You never know how non-respondents would have answered. But you can never assume that they would answer the same way, right? That's not going to work. We talked about social desirability bias a bit, but this is how people will sometimes answer to look good or to please you rather than telling the truth, right? Do you litter? And everyone would probably say no, even though there is litter everywhere, right? Do you care about climate change? Most people would say yes, even if they don't, because they know that that's socially acceptable to answer, right? So you have to consider these things. You can make surveys anonymous, which will help, so people feel like they're being safe and they have a space to be honest. You can use neutral questions or wording that doesn't suggest right answers, right? Like I talked about, like in a previous lecture, like, does your neighbor kill elephants? You know anybody in the adjoining community who's killed an elephant, right? You can offer incentives to reduce non-response, but you need to be sure that you're not creating coercion, right? This is where trust building comes into play before you survey. And this takes time, but it does make a real difference. Now, if you're going to provide compensation, many surveys do, it just needs to be approved by the ethics board, which we're going to talk about that procedure at a high level. And you just need to be sure that you're not creating like a situation where you're biasing it by having like a $100 reward or something like that, right? And how you structure your survey is going to affect whether people complete it, just flat out, right? You should really frame it like you're framing a research proposal so that people follow it logically, right? The introduction should explain who you are, the survey's purpose, how you're going to protect confidentiality, right? These are often requirements by the ethics committees, and give them a realistic time. Like, how long is this going to take? So you can set expectations and be honest, right? If it takes 15 minutes, say 15 minutes. Don't say 5 minutes, or people are going to quit when they realize that you lied, right? And they're going to be annoyed. Begin with a warm up. This is a great strategy, an easy sort of softball to build momentum, right? So we talked about interviews, setting the tone. How long have you lived in this neighborhood, right? Easy question that gets people engaged right away. Then you can move to your core questions about the actual research topics, right? It's a good idea often to save demographics for the end because they're quite easy to answer, even when people are fatigued and they're kind of boring. If you start with demographics, people sometimes quit immediately. It's just like a phenomenon within the social sciences. But let's say if they've already answered 20 interesting questions about environmental concerns, and completing the demographics section is just kind of logical because they're invested in it's stuff they don't have to recall, right? Even a thank you explaining what happens next and how they can get results if they're interested. This is really important to end with this. And, again, don't just take their information and disappear. That's not, justice informed research. Length really matters enormously. Okay. For general public surveys, you really want to aim for 10 to 15 minutes maximum. People have short attention spans, they're busy. They have demands for their time. So, for more engaged groups that you have built trust with, who are really interested in this topic, right? 20 to 30 minutes could be fine. Longer than that, and you're going to see completion rates plummet. And every question you include beyond that looks at a risk of losing respondents, right? So it really is, true that you need to make every question count. So pre-testing piloting is often the step that everyone wants to quit. Okay. And I can say very strongly, don't skip it. I'm serious, right? Pre-testing means that you're testing your survey with a small group of people similar to your target population before you're launching it widely, right? So you can ask this group to kind of work through questions in a collaborative way, right? So think aloud, like, tell me your feedback. Are you confused by this question? They can say, like, I'm not sure which option to choose because my situation doesn't fit any of these, right? This is way too long. You're going to identify these problems before you get this in front of a broader audience. It gives you a chance to really, you know, fill in gaps, go with missing response options and improve flow and logic, right? And you can check the actual timing. That survey that you thought would take 10 minutes, now it actually takes 25, right? So you have to be able to be flexible and be ready to revise based on this feedback and test again if you have to make major changes, right? This saves you money, time, waste of research. I have personally seen surveys where questions were completely misunderstood by every single respondent. No joke, right? Because the researchers, and this researcher is myself, right? We didn't discover this until we had already collected a substantial amount, right? And by then it's too late. All that data could be garbage, right? So don't waste months of work. Don't waste your participants' time. Don't be that researcher, right? Pre-test, pilot. Trust me, you will not regret it. And when it comes to ethics in survey research, right, it really is similar to interviews, but it does go way beyond IRB approval and checking boxes, right? We're talking about FPIC. Informed consent really means that participants, do they generally understand what they're agreeing to, right? What's the survey about? How long does it take? How will this information be used? Who will see it? Can they quit? Right? Understanding the difference between confidentiality and anonymity, right? Confidentiality means that some people might be able to know that they completed the survey. They might be able to identify them. Anonymity means that you're protecting their identity. They cannot, there's no way they can be identified, right? So again, confidential, let me just read this off my notes so it's really clear. Confidential means you know who participated, but you won't tell anyone. Anonymous means you don't even know who participated, right? There's no way to link those responses to an individual. It's really important to think about because you don't want to make a claim that you're going to, do an anonymous survey and then you don't, right? That's bad, bad, bad. Promise only what you can deliver. Remember that, right? Be clear. Make sure everything is voluntary. Make sure you're thinking about extra protections for vulnerable population. What does data security mean, right? Where are you going to store the data? Who has access? How long do you plan to keep it? Standard IRB consent protects institutions from liability, but it may not be protecting the participants, right? It's designed to prevent the university from getting sued in many cases, but justice-oriented consent is protecting community self-determination, right? And that's a very different goal requiring different approaches, okay? Equally, environmental justice contexts, they require ethical attention, right? There's a history here that matters. Communities of color, low income communities, and indigenous communities, they've already been, in many cases, exploited by researchers for decades. It's just, the sad reality. In terms of an example, a horrible example, the Tuskegee syphilis study, where Black men were deliberately left untreated. There are, examples of forced sterilization studies, unconsented radiation experiments. This isn't ancient history. This happened recently, right? These are well-founded distrusts of researchers, especially white researchers from large universities that are still very present in communities across the US and the globe today, right? You have to think about this. Language barriers, varying literacy, right? You might need trained bilingual interviewers, right? That's what I use. And I don't even go to the interviews because I don't want to bias the results, right? Or the survey results, right? So you can't just think about translating, on the back end, right? This is not solving a literacy barrier. Fear of authorities or retaliation, again, confidentiality versus anonymity, right? Research fatigue. You have to take these things into consideration, right? And again, in some cases, like we talked about compensation and coercion, right? Compensation isn't just nice. In some cases, it is ethical, right? You should pay people for their time and knowledge. If you're gonna ask them to divulge personal information, right? You should, pay them for their time, right? And think about how that's avoiding coercion and remaining ethical. But again, just keep these critical questions in mind, right? Who benefits from this research? What do participants get? How does this avoid repeating extractive research patterns that have maybe harmed this community historically, right? So you need to understand a lot about the context you're working in, right? And we already talked about, FPIC in terms of conservation, but again, this is a framework that can be really useful in this situation for setting up how you're going to make your survey as safe as possible, right? So decisions are going to be made by individuals on the spot. These are different from the decisions made by communities after discussion or deliberation, right? Don't forget that. So again, I don't want to go too deep into FPIC. You can watch that lecture, right? But I did have a critical question here. So, you know, what happens when individual consent conflicts with community refusal, right? So imagine you want to survey 50 residents about a sacred site. All 50 individually consent to participate, but the tribal council says no. They say research about the site violates cultural protocols and they refuse to allow it. Whose consent matters in the situation, right? Individual rights versus collective sovereignty, right? Standard research ethics would say that individual consent is sufficient. But FPIC says community authority is going to supersede that individual consent in some context, right? Again, this is not easy. This could totally derail your project. It could make things very difficult, but it's something you need to think about, right? What is the ethical standard? What is your safeguarding program that you're using to conduct your data? If you're doing justice informed research, should you be operating within a rights based framework, right? What is the history of this place? How could this potentially negatively impact a community, right? So let me show you again, like what consent would look like in practice, right? Standard consent on an extractive model would be I'm conducting research on environmental health. Participation is voluntary. Your responses will be confidential. This survey takes 15 minutes. Again, that's technically fine. It met IRB requirements, but what's missing, right? It's that FPIC informed consent. FPIC consent would sound like I'm Tyler from the University of Colorado Boulder. I'd like to learn about environmental health experiences in your community. My goal is to support advocacy for policy change. And before you decide whether to participate, here's what you should know, right? The purpose of this research is to gauge environmental pollutants impacts on infants. Findings will be shared with the FDA and the local government council to support better health outcomes for your community. You have control throughout the process. You can stop anytime. You can skip any questions that make you uncomfortable, and you can withdraw your responses later if you change your mind. In terms of community benefit, results will be shared back with community organization, right? A local NGO to support better health. I want to be very transparent about my benefit too. I'm doing this for my degree, for publication, etc. I'm not pretending that this is purely altruistic. It'll take 15 minutes. As compensation, I'm offering $15 in cash for your time. Here's my contact information if you have questions, or you can contact a community liaison at this number. Do you have any questions before deciding? Would you like to think about it? Would you like to participate? Right. So there's transparency about power, benefit, reciprocity. There's multiple points where they can ask questions or refuse. Acknowledgement that about my positionality and that I'm benefiting, and then clear statements about what they're getting. Right. This is what FPIC informed consent can look like. Okay. I'm going to skip through a few notes about response rates, but again, we can discuss these more if you want, more in-depth discussion about this or meeting with me in office hours. Skip this. So I'm skipping some discussion about logic and piping and some kind of just like in the weeds notes that I have here about like how to create like user-friendly interfaces, right? But we have to get into in the sort of supported time, but survey data analysis, right? So again, I'm not a statistician. You're probably not, right? But you do need some basic literacy and stats, right? Descriptive statistics can answer the questions about what do the data show. Frequency and percentages are going to be simple counts, right? 40% of respondents reported smelling this chemical odor weekly. Your means, medians, and modes are going to be different types of averages. The mean is the sum divided by count. Median is the middle value. Mode is the most common value. You can run crosstabs to compare groups. Low income residents reported odors twice as often as high income residents. Use bar charts, pie charts, make them visible and accessible. Then you can also kind of go a little bit deeper, right? Inferential statistics answer, right? Questions like, can we generalize beyond our sample to the broader population? This is where sample size, who's in your population, this all matters, right? So chi-square tests compare categorical variables, right? So we can look at, is there a statistically significant relationship between, let's say, neighborhood and health symptoms, okay? Two variables. T-tests are going to compare the means between groups, right? Do residents near the facility report significantly higher concern than residents farther away? Or could this difference be due to chance, right? Correlation measures are looking at a clear relationship between variables, right? And then regression is predicting outcomes based on multiple factors, right? And if you take a stats class, which this is not, you will learn these. But for now, just know that they exist. Understand that they will help you determine whether patterns in your sample likely exist in the broader population or might just be due to chance, right? And this is going to strengthen the evidence of your argument. Now, with open-ended responses, this goes back to like our interview data and our qualitative analysis, right? This takes more time. You've got to read the responses, get a sense for overall patterns. You got to code categories, right? If you haven't watched that lecture, I hope you have. You can go back to that. But this is where you go into those like in vivo, Atlas TI for qualitative analysis, open-ended analysis, looking at themes, narratives, etc. Common mistakes. Let's learn them so you don't make them, right? First is, we talked about it, making surveys too long. People quit. Every question you include risks losing respondents. And if someone quits halfway, that could be total garbage, that whole survey, right? And they're not going to take it again. If your survey takes 30 minutes, maybe 20% of people will complete it, right? If it takes 10 minutes, maybe 60% will complete it, right? Which one do you want? Those are very different samples. Second, don't skip pre-testing, right? You're going to discover the problems. And this is going to really help you to make it better before you put it in front of a bunch of people and you don't get what you want out of it, right? Third, write these questions carefully and ensure there's not bias in them, right? Have somebody else read them. Your data, will reflect these biased questions, not reality, and that's not useful, right? Don't have missing response options, right? You force people into wrong categories, right? What race are you? White, Black, Hispanic? This includes Asian, Native American, Pacific Islander, multiracial people, right? Like, why are you forcing them into this? This would make somebody quit immediately if this was the first question. Fifth is ignoring non-response bias, right? Thinking about, well, you're not thinking about the gap, the shadow, the people who didn't participate, right? How might they differ from those who did? And sixth is over-interpreting results, right? Correlation doesn't equal causation, right? Just because people who reported health symptoms also live near industrial facilities doesn't prove the facilities cause the symptoms without ruling out other explanations, right? We need to be reliable arbiters and interpreters of our data, especially in this day and age, right? 7 is convenience sampling only, right? Surveying only easy to reach people, right? If you survey only online, you're going to miss people without internet, right? That's often the most marginalized, right? Your results are going to tell you about people with internet, and that might be not actually the people who are experiencing environmental injustice. And 8 is what we've talked about over and over again, but extractive research without reciprocity, right? You took the people's time and knowledge. What did they get? If the answer is nothing, you did extraction, not research, just full stop. So let's talk about some examples. Let's see, I'll go through some examples about toxic exposure to see how question wording matters. So I'll go through these quickly, but a bad question would be, for example, are you worried about the dangerous chemicals poisoning our neighborhood? Like, what's wrong with this, right? It's a leading language question. It's assuming that the chemicals are first present. I'm making an assumption and putting it onto them that they're dangerous. And I'm assuming that they're poisoning people, right? I'm telling them how to answer, right? Of course, they're going to say yes. A better question would be, how concerned are you, if at all, about chemical exposure in your neighborhood, right? You could have response options from not at all concerned to very concerned or extremely concerned, right? All the way up. It's neutral wording. That's really important. The if at all is acknowledging that some people might not be concerned at all. That's a legitimate response, right? You're measuring concern without suggesting what that level of appropriate concern is, right? It's going to help you see actual variation in concern, which is what you're trying to get at, rather than just everyone agreeing with your framing, right? And then a good follow-up question could be, an open-ended follow-up question could be, what specific environmental health concerns, if any, do you have, right? Now you're letting people describe issues in their own words, which is great. And you're not imposing categories, right? So maybe they'll mention those chemicals. Maybe they'll mention something else that you haven't thought of, right? Open-ended questions are going to let participants' priorities emerge more naturally within the data. So another example would be, like, your research question is, do low income neighborhoods experience more air pollution exposure and perceive health risks differently than higher income neighborhoods, right? Comparative question with equity implications. So your survey approach would use stratified sampling, intentionally selecting low income, middle income, and high income neighborhoods to ensure that you can run that comparison, right? You'd probably do in person surveys at community locations where people are accessible, like libraries, community centers, parks. Why in person? Because you want good response rates, right? And you want to include people without reliable internet access who may not have a phone or who wouldn't pick up the phone, right? This is correlating to income. The internet and the income is connected. Your survey, would need questions covering several areas: pollution exposure, using both objective measures, like how often do you smell unusual odors, and subjective experiences, like how often does air quality affect your activities, right? Health symptoms, asking about respiratory problems, headaches, eye irritation. Perceived risk, measuring how concerned people are about health impacts, right? Trust in authorities would be a good line of inquiry, because this, affects whether people believe official statements that the air is safe, right? And also support for regulations, measuring whether people want stronger environmental protections, and then putting demographics at the end: income, education, race, age. And then you provide compensation, maybe a $10 or $15 gift card for a 15-minute survey, right? Again, this would all need to be approved by the IRB or the, ethics board that you're working with. But, you make a critical commitment to them. You make a commitment to them that you're going to share results back with communities through community meetings or forums, or an accessible report posted here, right? Not just an academic journal that's going to cost them $40 to read. Oh man. So again, the design connects method to research questions, and this builds in equity considerations as an example. If you want to talk more about, like, examples for your final project or your own personal interest in research, let me know, and we can talk more about that, right? But again, I want to emphasize too that surveys work best as part of mixed methods research when you combine multiple approaches. So you can use interviews to explain the why behind survey patterns, and then your survey, can show, for example, like 60% of residents are very concerned about water quality. Well, the interviews can then explain what specific experiences led to that concern, right? Or focus groups can help develop additional relevant survey questions before you even write them, right? Talking to community members, adding these mixed methods are really important. We're going to talk about participatory research in another lecture, but this is a great way to shift power dynamics, right? Community-based participatory research involves community members as partners in all research stages, not just subjects. They're collaborators. And so this co-design means that community members will help write questions, ensuring relevance and cultural appropriateness, right? So they might ask a question, or they might say, right, that question doesn't make sense for our community, or here's what you should actually be asking about, right? Community members can be the surveyors, which increases access and trust, right? So there's ways to make this, do two things at once, right? Pet two dogs with one hand, or something like that, right? So again, just drawing a final parallel, right? Research can be an extractive industry, like mining or logging, like we talked about, right? Think about the structure. Researchers take community knowledge, that's raw material. They convert it to publications, dissertations, degrees, career advancement. Those are the processed goods with value, right? Where communities receive little or nothing, right? Are we just reinforcing neoliberal, neocolonial pathways with our research, right? The profits leave, benefits accrue to researchers, to universities, to academic journals, external actors. These are the same patterns we talked about in the neocolonial, lecture, right? So let's not do that, right? Let's ensure that research leads to action. What do communities get? Can we think about capacity building and skill development, not just data extraction, not just publications? If you take this seriously, research might look different. We can make that change within research, right? But that's what aligning research with justice principles requires, right? So that's all I have for you today. I appreciate your attention during this lecture. Again, any questions about surveys or you want to talk about your own research, anything like that, let me know. I'm very happy to dive deeper into this ahead. Awesome. Take care.